Hello friends, for today's video I want to go through a list of some epic fantasy recommendations. I did a similar style video about a year or so ago, and that one was a bit more straightforward in that it was simply going through stories that fit under the umbrella of epic, and the thing that sets these stories apart today is that these are all part of shared worlds. Obviously not shared worlds with each other, but these from one recommendation to the next take part within a shared universe or a shared world. I will make clear when it is recommended that you read a certain one over the other first to get the most out of the reading experience of these. And in order for me to even talk about these and qualify for them to be on the list, I have to have read multiple installments with these. So of course there are more outside of the ones that I'm going to talk about. And if you have your own recommendations, please feel free to leave those in the comments down below. That way anybody who's looking to truly find an epic world to sink their teeth into not only has my recommendations, but yours as well. Kicking it off, I wanted to start with S.A. Chakraborty. First up, we have the Daevabad trilogy. This is an example of one that you do not have to read before reading the other, as they are fairly separate from each other, but they do exist within the same world. And even S.A. Chakraborty's Daevabad trilogy already is quite epic in nature. It starts out as a historical fantasy and portal fantasy, and the lore is incredibly rich. There's a lot to the stakes and the understanding of why the culture is the way it is and why certain groups hate each other and why it's this long lasting thing that seems like it's never going to be disentangled and repaired, but the characters are working toward a better world anyway, and they're pushing through. And I really, really loved the characters in that story. I loved the world. I thought that it just got better and better the more you went into it. And the return to the series, each time I picked up the next installment, I just felt like coming home. And what's nice is it's a trilogy, so it's 3 and then it's done. And when it comes to epic fantasy, it's hard to find something truly epic feeling with that far-reaching lore that doesn't feel like it needs to be beyond a trilogy. So it was impressive what the author was able to do within just 3 books. And then if you actually wanted to go a little bit in a different direction when it comes to the tone and the kind of story you get, you have The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi. Currently the first book is out and the sequel is scheduled to be released in late 2025. So if you are looking to get into it, this could be a fun one to jump into, because then you can join the hype train and wait for the sequel like a lot of other individuals. But Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi is certainly more action oriented. It's fast paced. It moves very quickly. And something that's really, really loved about this story is that the main character, not only is she charming and really likable, but she's also an older protagonist, which is relatively rare. She's not only older, but she's also a parent, and that definitely contributes to her views in life and how she navigates the world and what she lives for and how she lives, because she has her own personality, her own wants, her own desires, but she also has this small child who she loves more than anything in the world, and she can't just do whatever she wants. She has to care for this sweet, adorable girl. And so I do feel like the protagonist is just amazing all around, and not a protagonist that you see all that often. Regardless though, the world is amazing, the lore is amazing, the magic is really great. I say more so specifically with Daevabad. If you're looking for something more fast-paced and fun, then The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi fulfills that, but this in general is just such a great world to get into. Next up, we have 2 authors that on occasion I actually say if you like one, you might like the other, so I'm going to group these together, but obviously their shared worlds are their own, and those would be Richard Swan and Joe Abercrombie. I'm sure most people are very aware of Joe Abercrombie's works. You have the First Law trilogy, and then you have a series of standalones, and then you have The Age of Madness. I love Age of Madness. Unfortunately, it is advised that if you want to read Age of Madness, that you should likely read the First Law trilogy first. And I'm not saying unfortunately because it's such a slog or anything like that, but simply because, I mean, it's a big ask to say like, oh yeah, read this trilogy first, and then maybe read some standalones, and then read Age of Madness. I know it's a lot to get to that last point. However, the journey there is fantastic. It's great. There's a reason that people consider Joe Abercrombie to be the father of Grimdark, or that what do they call him? Lord Grimdark or something like that. He's just the king of Grimdark fantasy because he captures the bleakness, that feeling of what's the point, nothing ever changes, and also kind of a satire and critique of fantasy also while embracing fantasy and being dark and funny at the same time. It's a magical combination and it's fantastic. But speaking of magical, if you're somebody who absolutely loves epic fantasy with a really intense magic system, that's not necessarily what you're getting out of Joe Abercrombie's works. It's more gritty and real and a reflection of our own society, but in a way where it's kind of nice to hold the mirror up to our own world and look at it through something more fantastical, because it makes it almost easier to digest, but it's still a really cutting examination of our world. I absolutely love Abercrombie. I feel like I progressively get less and less coherent the more I talk about how much I love his works, because I just think they're so good. But anyway, Richard Swan. I do think that the prose is somewhat similar, though not nearly as funny, but the way that Richard Swan delivers his story, I feel like there's some similarities, and that if you like one, you might like the other. And one of the similarities, I do feel like both of them are relatively grim, and they capture characters where you're not necessarily following the most heroic characters that are ones you want to model yourself after. You often find yourself reflecting on society through the ways that the characters fit within that, which is especially true of the Empire of the Wolf trilogy, which is the one that I think a lot of people on BookTube, myself included, have talked about quite a lot. It starts with the Justice of Kings, and in that story, you're really examining what it is for any one individual to have too much power. Then, with the newest story, Grave Empire, I think one of the pieces of Empire of the Wolf that really shined was the eldritch horror things that are woven into the fantasy setting. And Grave Empire, it feels like gloves are coming off and we're really embracing that. Currently, it's just the first book that is out of that new series. I cannot wait for the next installment because I really enjoyed that first one. And it's been a long time since I've hated a character as much as I hated a character in that story, but in a good way. I despised a character in that. But if you're not necessarily looking for epic fantasy in the way that people, when they think epic fantasy, they think something like Wheel of Time. If you don't necessarily want these fantasy-rich worlds, but you just want there to be a lot of something to consume, I definitely think both of these authors fulfill that. And they still both utilize fantasy, just not necessarily in the more sword and sorcery traditional lens that we've seen in the past. For our next recommendations, we certainly do have authors who utilize fantasy in the more magical way, and that would be Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere and V.E. Schwab. And V.E. Schwab, the Shades of Magic trilogy, the way that it first came out is it came out as a trilogy due to some things that had happened with publishing in V.E. Schwab's past. If I've gathered the information correctly, the Archive series, which is not part of Shades of Magic, but I do want to make note of this because I think it's significant and important to know, that Shades of Magic came out after the Archive series. And the Archive series, V. Schwab had started it, there were some things that happened with publishing, and they did not keep going with her series. And then when Shades of Magic came out, even though she had always intended for there to be more, I'm not sure if it was a precaution to write it as a trilogy initially, but that's what she did. Then you can see clearly from the end of that trilogy that she has more in store, because there are certain pieces of that third book that definitely indicate that this world is bigger than what you're seeing in this trilogy. And I wanted to make note of that because I do think it's important for people to have the right expectations when they go in. While you do have the conclusion of the main arc within that trilogy, it certainly feels like there's some doors that are left open. And now we are finally getting Threads of Power. The first book of that series is out, but it's just so nice to get to see V.E. Schwab's vision for this finally realized. Point is, though, if you don't know anything about Shades of Magic, which I'm sure you do because V.E. Schwab and Sanderson are both very well known, but you follow a world where there are special individuals that have the ability to go between parallel worlds, and one of our main characters, Kel, is somebody who has this ability, but in doing this, he ends up accidentally sort of inviting in this antagonistic force into his world, and then it's race to the finish line. It's just this breakneck speed trying to ensure that their world survives this threat. And then in Fragile Threads of Power, you do actually have some characters from Shades of Magic. This is an example of marketing says you don't have to read Shades of Magic first, but I would advise that you do, because some of the characters from the original trilogy do show up in Threads of Power, and a lot of what's going on with them is sort of an aftermath of what they endured in the initial trilogy. So I would recommend, to get the most out of the characters, that you do read Shades of Magic first. And also, I think it's just helpful to have a firmer grasp on the world. They're pretty close together time-wise as well. So then within Fragile Threads of Power, the first book is out. Can't wait for when we get the second and third installments, but you're finally getting to see the world expanded on. So Shades of Magic feels somewhat contained. Threads of Power feels like, okay, now we get to kind of what I described with Richard Swan, like gloves are coming off. I'm going to embrace the eldritch horror. With Shades of Magic, it's like gloves are coming off. I'm exploring this big world that I have made that I didn't get to explore every corner of within Shades of Magic. We're gonna explore more of it, and that includes exploring more of the magic, which is really quite exciting. And then, of course, with the Cosmere, there are a number of different recommended reading orders. Sanderson himself has talked about his recommended reading orders. Many people online have talked about recommended reading orders. I think the safest thing to say is that if you want to get really into specifically the Stormlight Archive, then at some point, the further into Stormlight Archive you get, the more you're going to want to have read the other series. But there are some that are currently standalones, like Warbreaker and Elantris, so those are avenues in. You have the original Era 1 Mistborn, that's an avenue in. Of course, you probably don't really want to read Era 2 without having read Era 1, so there are multiple points of entry. But the further in, as I stated, the further into Stormlight Archive you get, you're going to want to have read those other ones because they do start to play a role with each other. And the fun part is that it really feels like this universe. It doesn't just feel like these books take place in the same world. That's what it's going to feel like initially. But if you want that feeling of a shared universe, you're going to get that the more in that you get. I think what is starting to get a little bit convoluted is that there are other books that are considered Cosmere novels. For example, Tress of the Emerald Sea, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. These are Cosmere novels. These ones feel less like they're involved in the Stormlight Archive plot. So it starts to get a little bit unclear as to what you should read when. So I'll have Sanderson's recommended reading order. But once again, there are a lot of points of entry, and I can't really give an overview of every single series and every single book because that would take a really long time. I do have an entire playlist dedicated, though, to the Cosmere if that's something that you're interested in, but there aren't too many other massive epic worlds just within their series, like something with Stormlight Archive, but then also within being part of a shared universe, quite like the Cosmere. The next ones I'm going to mention are a little bit different in that they actually go across mediums, and that would be League of Legends and Witcher. Witcher, I say, goes across mediums. I'll get to that one in a moment, but I'll go ahead and stick with League of Legends. So I have read Ambessa, Chosen of the Wolf. I've read Ruination, and I love Arcane. So if you're interested in seeing more about any of those individually, I'll have all of that linked. In fact, I'll have any relevant information in the description bar down below in case you'd like to get a little bit more info on any of the things talked about today. But I am not necessarily well versed in League of Legends overall. That is an entire thing that many people know a lot about the lore with. As somebody who is a huge fan of video games but hasn't gotten into League of Legends, I know about some things tangentially, like there's a periphery, a bit of knowledge in that sense, but not to the degree that some people have. However, I love Arcane, as noted, and I have picked up the books. And Arcane and Ambessa, Chosen of the Wolf are somewhat connected. You do not have to watch Arcane to read Ambessa, and you don't have to read Ambessa to watch Arcane. But I would say if you wanted to get the most out of maybe a fun experience, I would say watching season 1 of Arcane, then reading Ambessa, then watching season 2 is a pretty safe bet because you're going to understand the characters and their motivations a little bit better, but it is not necessary. You're welcome to just watch one and then read, or read and then watch. And then with Ruination, it is very, very separate. I have a feeling it's going to become more relevant the more shows that get put out by the studio that did Arcane, because they are going to be exploring different areas. And some of the video games, there's actually one where there's a certain scene that kind of kicks the game off that's just straight out of Ruination, or I should say Ruination sort of is exactly that. So there are pieces that are explored, but the way that they're done is that you don't have to have knowledge of one in order to pick up the other. So you have Arcane, you have Ambessa, you have Ruination. You can get into any of these. I've said before that I feel like both the novels for League of Legends are both just like this fun return to this kind of like action fantasy story. And then you have both a combination of great character movement and plot movement. It feels like it's relatively equal as opposed to just feeling character driven or mostly feeling plot driven. I actually feel like it accomplished a combination, which is great. Also, fun fact, the Ambessa audiobook is narrated by the voice actor from the Arcane show, so that's a fun integration. And then the Ruination audiobook is quite a good production. Then of course Arcane is fantastic. If you haven't checked out Arcane, I highly recommend it. Now Witcher, a little asterisk around Witcher. So technically the events of the video games are not canon. That said, a lot of us were like, well, I'm considering it. And there is a show. It makes me a little sad that most people know Witcher nowadays through the show, because for me it's the worst version of it. However, as far as my like of it, I would say you can check out the video games, specifically Witcher the Wild Hunt, and then now we have a new one that is scheduled to come out eventually. When, I don't know, but I'm excited. Then you have the books, which take place before the video games. I'm just mentioning my like of them. For me, it goes video games, books, show. But the books are, as far as the events of things, they happen first. And even within the books, the timeline's a little confusing. But you have the books that take place, and the video games are a what-if scenario as to what might happen after. Then you have the TV show that is an adaptation of the books, but I definitely feel like they were slightly inspired by events of the games as well. They try to combine it. Then there are all these shows that came out that aren't necessarily the Witcher show, but take place in the Witcher world. And again, part of the reason I'm doing this asterisk is because it's all Witcher for the most part, as far as the stuff that I take seriously, which isn't the other offshoots. But there are other parts of the world, if it turns out to be something you really like, and maybe you'll really like the other shows. They basically did little movies and other such things, or mini-series to go along with it. I would just say, though, if you like the video games, maybe check out the books, or if you like the books, check out the games. But people have different things that they enjoy about Witcher, so it might just be a case-by-case basis. And then last, I wanted to mention some middle grade and young adult stories where you see this similar formula. So I'll start with Folk of the Air. Within Folk of the Air, you have the original trilogy, which starts with Cruel Prince. And then after that, you have a duology that has come out that actually takes note of some characters who showed up in the original trilogy and then explores their story within a duology. And Folk of the Air, it is probably recommended that you read that first, as there are characters that are within that show up in the other duology. And I will say that was one of my favorite parts of the duology after, was getting to see a return of those characters. But it is just kind of a fun world to come back to. It is very malevolent and wicked, which one of the books even has wicked in the title. It certainly knows its tone, and I think it embraces the Fae in the wicked way, where you're not just seeing them as just beautiful people who are pretty and they're basically human-like. Instead, they are truly terrifying, and yes, they're beautiful, but it's all this deception, and everybody's trying to get power. The Fae can't lie, so they're always trying to find ways to trick each other, and our main character is a human who is trying to navigate this world and find her own sense of agency and power within it. And then, as noted in the duology that comes after, you are looking at some characters that showed up as children initially in the original trilogy who are now older. Then we also have the Grishaverse. This is one of the only ones on the list today where I haven't read everything, because within Grishaverse you have the original Shadow and Bone trilogy. You also have a show adaptation, which was, I thought, a pretty good adaptation of this material. But you have the Shadow and Bone trilogy, then you have the Six of Crows duology, and then you have the King of Scars duology. And I read the first book in that duology, but I didn't really love it, so I didn't continue on. However, there are a lot of books to check out. And you can read Six of Crows before Shadow and Bone. You can read Shadow and Bone before Six of Crows. Technically, Shadow and Bone takes place first, and in Six of Crows, they somewhat hint at certain events within Shadow and Bone, but it's maybe not what you would think. So Shadow and Bone, if you do read Six of Crows first, is going to elaborate on the story that is referenced in Six of Crows, but you really can read them separate, as they're relatively separate from each other. The show somewhat combines them, so you're going to get a mix, but that's the layout for those. As far as the King of Scars duology, you're probably going to want to have read everything from Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows to really fully get the most out of King of Scars. And the last recommendation would be the books by Pierce. So we have The Song of the Lioness, which I've brought up a number of times because this was a childhood favorite for me, but this does take place once again in a shared world, and the story that explores this character, Alanna, is recommended to be read first, or at least that would be my recommendation. You also have a story that explores another character where the story from this one shows up in it, and then I don't think I ever got a chance to read it, but I'm pretty sure you even explore the child of one of the characters in another series, and it's just really awesome, I think, to see this sort of framework for a world within something for middle grade readers. It just, I think, is such a fun way to have younger people get to sink their teeth into what fantasy is capable of and getting these references and these little Easter eggs. I just think that that's great, and it makes me oddly nostalgic. So if you are looking for a story that does this but is for younger readers, maybe you have a child in your life, whether it's your own or a niece or nephew or anything like that, and you think it would be fun to buddy read something with them, this could be such a fun one because you'd have so many books that you could get through, and then you could compare and contrast the different stories in the different series. But in general, that's it for a list of some stories that are within shared worlds and shared universes. As noted before, feel free to leave your own recommendations, and I will, as I said before, have any additional information in the description bar down below. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.